The unbreakable human. The Grand Hall of the Vorl'Kai Empire was a place where lesser beings learned to bow, where rulers and conquerors gathered beneath the towering crystalline chandeliers, casting refracted light over 100 species. Tonight, the hall pulsed with the hum of alien voices, their languages interwoven into a tapestry of whispers, growls, and reverberating clicks. And yet, despite the towering figures of reptilian warlords, cybernetic overlords, and telepathic monarchs, the lone human in the room stood unbowed. Ambassador Daniel Carter adjusted the stiff collar of his formal Earth-issued uniform, his sharp blue eyes scanning the chamber as if he were merely surveying a diplomatic banquet, rather than standing among creatures who could end him with a thought. Humans were new to the Galactic Council, a species regarded as barely above primitive. Resilient, yes, but physically unimpressive compared to the armored Solthians, the telepathic Vorl'Kai, or the genetically perfected Elthari. And yet, despite this reputation, the room could not ignore him. Neither could she. Princess Xyra Vorl'Kai, heir to the Vorl'Kai throne, stood at the heart of the gathering, her golden eyes locked onto him with something between amusement and suspicion. She was stunning, even by the diverse standards of the galaxy. Luminous silver skin shimmered beneath her midnight gown, her long dark hair braided with bands of living energy that pulsed in time with her breath. The air around her crackled with unspoken dominance, a presence that commanded without words. She was Vorl'Kai, a being gifted with telepathic supremacy, capable of bending lesser minds with the barest whisper. And yet, Daniel Carter did not bow. Her lips curled slightly as she observed him. How odd. She had reached out the moment he entered, a quiet probe brushing against his thoughts, a mere formality, a reminder that he stood within her domain. Yet what she had encountered was resistance. No, not resistance. A wall of fire. Daniel's mind had not just rejected her probe. It had burned it away, as though her influence were nothing more than a passing breeze against an immovable mountain. No one resisted her. The chamber stilled as Xyra took a slow sip of Aurelus wine, the deep red liquid swirling in her crystal goblet. Then she spoke, her voice carrying across the hall like a blade wrapped in silk. Human. The sound of her voice was enough to send lesser beings to their knees, the telepathic weight behind it pressing down like an unspoken command. Daniel Carter merely lifted an eyebrow. Princess. A ripple passed through the room. The boldness of his response did not go unnoticed. Some of the attending Vorl'Kai nobles turned toward Xyra, waiting, watching, to see how she would react to such insolence. Her golden eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time in many years, she felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity. She had played this game countless times, bending foreign diplomats, warriors, and rulers alike to her will. It was not power. Power was brutish, crude. No, what she wielded was something finer. Persuasion, control, the delicate art of bending minds without them realizing they had been shaped. Yet Daniel Carter stood before her, unaffected. That alone made him fascinating. Xyra took a single step forward, the crowd parting instinctively as she approached the human. Her gown flowed around her like liquid darkness, each movement laced with effortless grace. Daniel didn't move. She stopped mere inches from him, tilting her head slightly. He was taller than she expected. Not by much, but enough to irritate her. He smelled different, not like the sterile engineered perfection of the Elthari or the acrid musk of the Solthians. There was something unrefined about him, something untamed. How strange, she murmured, her voice soft yet commanding. Your kind is supposed to be fragile. Daniel smiled, slow and knowing. You should really stop believing everything you hear. Another ripple of tension spread through the hall. Some of the noble lords shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Xyra to break him. She reached out, this time not with mere curiosity, but with intention. Her telepathic influence poured over him, a silken force of will meant to bend him, to kneel him before her in a way that would appear subtle, like he had simply realized his rightful place. Nothing happened. Daniel Carter simply watched her, his blue eyes steady and unreadable. Xyra blinked. She increased the pressure. Still, nothing. A cold sliver of disbelief slid down her spine. Even the most disciplined minds in the galaxy, trained generals, cybernetic-enhanced strategists, had crumbled under her influence. And yet, this human stood unshaken. No, not unshaken. Unamused. He tilted his head slightly, as if feeling the edges of her psychic grip, testing it the way one tests the chill of a breeze. And then, he pushed back. For the first time in her life, Xyra felt her own mind being repelled. Not controlled, not overwhelmed, but rejected with calm, absolute certainty. Xyra inhaled sharply. Daniel's lips twitched in something that was not quite a smile. That all you've got? A human. Mocking her. The very idea was unthinkable. Yet instead of rage, Xyra felt something else surge through her. Something warm and infuriating. Excitement. Fascinating, she whispered. You resist me. Daniel stepped closer, his movement controlled, deliberate, not bowing, but meeting her. You keep saying that like it's a surprise. His voice was steady, warm, and edged with quiet confidence. Xyra watched him carefully, golden eyes searching for the cracks that should have been there. There were none. For the first time in her life, she was looking at something she could not bend. And she realized, with a thrill she had never known before, she did not want to bend him. No, she wanted to understand him. The game of power. The grand hall still hummed with an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the lively diplomatic exchanges that had filled the room only moments ago. Alien dignitaries, warlords, and noble elites watched in fascinated horror as the unbreakable human stood inches from Princess Xyra, his defiance a breach of every unspoken rule of the Vorl'Kai Empire. Xyra should have crushed him. A single flex of her will, a carefully woven whisper into his mind, and she could have made him kneel before her. And yet, Daniel Carter stood unshaken, his blue eyes burning with something she had never encountered before. Amusement. He wasn't just resisting her. He was challenging her. The idea sent a strange heat curling through her spine. The towering Solthian warlord nearby let out a low guttural growl. Does the human wish to die? Xyra heard the tension lacing his words, an unspoken promise that if she did not put Daniel in his place, someone else would. She turned slowly to the gathering crowd, her expression unreadable. Then, her lips curled in a slow, knowing smile. No, she mused, eyes flickering back to Daniel. I think he wishes to live. Fiercely. Daniel's smirk deepened. Glad we're on the same page. Xyra's fingers twitched at her side. What was this sensation? This impulse. It was infuriating. The urge to break him had shifted into something far more dangerous. The urge to test him. Walk with me, she commanded, her voice smooth as silk, yet laced with something sharp. A test. Daniel should have declined, should have backed away, given her the space to regain her dominance. Instead, he fell and stepped beside her, his pace matching hers as they moved through the towering obsidian archways that led into the Imperial Gardens. The crowd murmured behind them, the whispers of speculation growing louder. What was the princess doing? Why wasn't the human dead? Why had she not taken control of him? The answer was simple. Because she wanted more. The test of will. The Imperial Gardens were an otherworldly paradise, filled with towering crystalline trees and bioluminescent vines that pulsed like the veins of the planet itself. The air was thick with the scent of aurelus blossoms, a flower known to induce heightened senses and deep, consuming emotions. Xyra stopped beside a glowing silver pond, its surface rippling with unseen currents. She turned to Daniel, her golden eyes locked onto him, studying, calculating. Then, slowly, she reached up, brushing her fingers lightly against the exposed skin at his wrist. The air between them crackled. A calculated move. A test. A being of lesser will would have shivered beneath her touch, would have felt her influence seep into their thoughts like a slow-burning intoxication. But Daniel Carter was not lesser. His hand caught hers, strong, steady, warm. Her breath hitched. Xyra was used to eliciting submission with a mere touch. But Daniel's grip was different. He did not squeeze in aggression, did not recoil in fear. He met her, matched her. "Careful, princess," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against the quiet night. "You might enjoy this." Something tightened in her chest. No one spoke to her like this. No one touched her like this. The Vorl'Kai were a species of mental dominance, their culture built upon control. Her touch was supposed to be a demand, an unspoken assertion of superiority. Yet now she was the one feeling unsteady. Daniel leaned in slightly, not pressing, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of him. "Tell me something," he continued, voice as smooth as a predator circling its prey. "How many times have people fallen to their knees for you, Xyra?" She inhaled sharply at the sound of her name, unadorned by title or rank. Too many times to count. It was expected, natural. But Daniel's voice made her question if any of them had done it willingly. Slowly, she pulled her hand away, taking a single step back. For the first time, she needed distance. This human, this fragile, insignificant human, was turning the game against her. She hated it. And yet, she wanted to play. Xyra tilted her head, studying him. "And you?" she asked, her voice laced with dangerous curiosity. "How many times have you bowed before someone like me?" Daniel chuckled, a deep, rich sound that sent a shiver up her spine. "Never," he admitted, his smirk unwavering. "And I don't plan to start now." The admission sent a thrill through her, sharp and unexpected. She should have been furious, should have asserted her dominance, made him regret his defiance. But instead, all she could think about was how intoxicating it felt to be resisted. Xyra had spent her entire life commanding the stars, bending minds, controlling everything within her reach. And yet, here stood a human who refused to yield. Fascinating. A dangerous proposition. The night stretched between them, charged with an unspoken energy neither of them dared to acknowledge. Xyra let the silence linger, her mind working through this unexpected puzzle in front of her. Then, finally, she spoke. "A game, then." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what kind of game?" Her lips curved into something almost wicked. "You stay here, among the Vorl'Kai, for one cycle. Let's see if you're truly as unbreakable as you pretend to be." Daniel's smirk did not falter. "And if I win?" Xyra's golden eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "Then, perhaps," she said softly, "I will finally have met someone worthy of standing at my side." A bold declaration. One that no Vorl'Kai noble had ever heard from their princess before. Daniel held her gaze, and for the first time, he saw something in her that went beyond control. A challenge, an invitation, and damned if he didn't want to see where it led. His smirk deepened. "Then let's play." The edge of control. The royal palace of Vorl'Kai 5 was not built for humans. The ceilings soared too high. The halls were too vast. The very air hummed with a psychic weight that pressed against the uninitiated like an invisible tide. Daniel Carter felt none of it. As he walked beside Princess Xyra, through the corridors carved from obsidian and laced with bioluminescent veins of energy, he felt the eyes of her people on him, watchful, calculating, expectant. They wanted to see him fail. They wanted to see her break him. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Xyra led him into a dimly lit chamber, the walls pulsing with an ambient energy that made his skin prickle. A Vorl'Kai mind reader would probably have crumbled by now, drowning in the overwhelming mental presence embedded into the room. But Daniel Carter was no ordinary diplomat. He had survived wars. He had walked through battlefields where the air was thick with blood and fire. He had stood before men and monsters alike, staring down death itself. And still, nothing had prepared him for the woman standing in front of him. Xyra turned, her golden eyes glinting in the dim light. She was assessing him again, just as she had done in the Grand Hall. Only this time, she wasn't looking for weakness. She was looking for limits. How far could she push him? How much could he take before he broke? She took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Daniel," she murmured, her voice wrapping around his name like silk. "Do you know what this room is?" He glanced around. A test. Xyra's lips curled. Correct. She closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion. The scent of her, electric, dark, intoxicating, pressed against his senses. "Everything here exists to amplify my will," she whispered. "It is designed to make lesser beings yield." Her fingers traced a delicate line up his chest. "And you?" She tilted her head, golden eyes alight with curiosity. "You are still standing." Daniel smirked. Disappointed. A soft chuckle escaped her. Amused. Intrigued. Maybe even impressed. But not yet satisfied. She moved even closer, her body now a breath away from his. "You still believe you're in control, don't you?" she murmured. Daniel's smirk didn't waver. "I know I am." Xyra's golden eyes darkened, and suddenly, Daniel felt it. The full weight of her telepathic power crashing down on him like a storm. It wasn't subtle anymore. No, this time, she was testing him in earnest. Demanding. Commanding. "Kneel." The word wasn't spoken aloud, but it rang through the room, reverberating against the walls like an undeniable force. The very air grew heavy. His muscles tensed. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. Most beings would have collapsed by now. Daniel didn't move. The pressure increased. Xyra's power pressed into his mind, curling like invisible hands around his thoughts, urging him to submit. He clenched his jaw. His breath came heavier. His body screamed at him to yield. And yet, he refused. His mind held firm, like an iron wall against the storm of her will. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, with deliberate slowness, Daniel Carter stepped forward. Into her power. And just like that, the storm shattered. Xyra staggered back, eyes wide in sheer disbelief. For the first time in her life, she had lost. The silence that followed was thick, charged with something neither of them dared to name. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if brushing off the weight of the unseen force. Then he smirked. Was that supposed to be difficult? Xyra's lips parted, as if searching for words. She was never at a loss for words. Never. And yet, for a fleeting moment, she could only stare at him. Because for the first time, she wasn't the one in control. And she liked it. The tension breaks. Xyra turned away sharply, her cloak swirling behind her as she stalked toward a nearby control panel. The subtle tension in her shoulders betrayed the emotion she was trying to suppress. She had pushed him to the edge, and he had pushed back. That had never happened before. Her fingers danced over the illuminated controls, disengaging the psychic amplifiers embedded in the chamber walls. The air grew lighter. The invisible weight vanished. She turned back to Daniel, eyes unreadable. "Most would call what you just did impossible," she said quietly. Daniel exhaled, crossing his arms. "Good thing I'm not most, then." Silence stretched between them. The raw energy of their confrontation still lingered in the air, unspoken, unresolved. And then, to his surprise, she laughed. A real laugh. Low, rich, filled with something Daniel couldn't quite place. "Perhaps you truly are worthy of standing at my side," she murmured, her gaze sliding over him with new consideration. He arched an eyebrow. "Is that an offer?" She smirked. "It's a warning." And yet, her eyes betrayed her. This human, he had changed something in her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control of what came next. And that was the most dangerous thrill of all. a passionate reckoning. The silence between them crackled like a storm about to break. Xyra had always been in control of her mind, of her power, of her emotions. Yet here, in the dim glow of the chamber, she felt something dangerous unraveling inside her. Daniel Carter stood before her, a human, a species supposedly weaker than her own, but he had just done the impossible. Resisted her, matched her, met her power with something even stronger. And worse, she wanted more. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He didn't move away, didn't flinch, just watched her, waiting, his blue eyes steady and unreadable. It was infuriating and intoxicating. She was used to people trembling beneath her gaze, but Daniel Carter, he just smirked. "You're staring, Princess." Xyra's fingers curled at her sides, her control slipping. "You enjoy provoking me," she murmured. Daniel exhaled a short laugh. "I enjoy seeing what happens when someone finally challenges you." A flicker of heat sparked in her chest. A challenge. She had spent her life bending people to her will, breaking them with nothing but her voice, her power, her presence. But he wouldn't break. No, he would make her fight for it. Xyra exhaled, forcing her composure back into place, even as something inside her rebelled. She was playing a dangerous game now, and she was starting to lose. The breaking point. She turned, pacing toward the large balcony that overlooked the neon skyline of Vorl'Kai. The city pulsed with the glow of hovering transports, illuminated towers stretching into the dark expanse of the sky. Daniel followed, stopping just beside her, close but not touching. His presence was infuriatingly steady. "I've spent my life perfecting control," she admitted quietly, keeping her gaze fixed on the city below. Daniel leaned on the railing beside her. "And yet, here you are, losing it." Her head snapped toward him. "You're bold for a human." He smirked, his voice low. "You like it." She did. It unnerved her. She should have silenced him, should have reminded him who she was, what she was. Instead, she reached out, not with her power, but with her hand. Her fingers brushed against his wrist, testing, expecting hesitation. Daniel didn't pull away, didn't tremble. Instead, he caught her hand, firm, warm, real. Xyra's breath hitched. His touch was different. It wasn't an attempt at control, wasn't a game of power. It was a challenge, a promise. Her pulse pounded. "This is a mistake." Daniel leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her skin. "Then tell me to stop." She opened her mouth, but no words came, because she didn't want him to. The fire between them. She was the one who moved first. Xyra crushed the space between them, her hand sliding up his chest, her breath uneven as her lips hovered just a breath away from his. Daniel didn't back away. He matched her intensity, his hands finding her waist, grounding her in a way she had never known before. There was no control here, no domination, only fire. Their lips met in a clash of heat and defiance, a battle of wills disguised as a kiss. Xyra was used to people yielding beneath her touch. Daniel didn't. He met her fire with his own, his hands gripping her tighter, pulling her closer. It wasn't submission. It was equal, consuming, raw. She felt unraveled, exposed in a way she had never been before. She had never wanted before. Not like this. When they finally pulled apart, she was breathless. Daniel smirked down at her. "Still think this is a mistake?" Xyra swallowed hard, her pulse racing. Yes, but she didn't care. Instead, she just whispered, "Again." And this time, when their lips met, there was no hesitation. The rise of a new era. The fire between them had burned through the night, consuming everything in its wake. For the first time in her life, Princess Xyra Vorl'Kai had surrendered, not to control, not to power, but to something far more dangerous, something real. But the moment of stolen passion was fleeting. Dawn broke over the Vorl'Kai skyline, and with it came the weight of reality. Xyra stood at the edge of her private chamber, gazing out at the city she had sworn to rule. The Vorl'Kai Empire was built on dominance, control, and absolute strength. And here she was, tangled in the sheets of a human, a species deemed inferior by her people. Her people would never accept this. Her father, the Emperor, would never allow it. She felt the shift in the air before she turned. Daniel stood near the doorway, already dressed, his sharp blue eyes watching her with that infuriating, knowing expression. "You're thinking too much," he said. Xyra exhaled slowly. "You should leave before the council realizes what's happened." Daniel leaned against the ornate doorway, crossing his arms. "And what exactly has happened, Princess?" Her jaw tightened. "A mistake." He smirked. "That's not what you said last night." Xyra turned sharply, her golden eyes flashing with warning. "This changes nothing." Daniel chuckled, low and unbothered. "Oh, it changes everything. And you know it." She hated that he was right. She had spent her life believing that love, passion, emotion, all of it was a weakness. Yet with one single night, she had unraveled her own convictions. And that terrified her more than any battle, more than any war. "I should command you to forget this," she murmured, "to walk away and never speak of it." Daniel took a slow step toward her. "And yet you haven't." Her pulse pounded. She couldn't. Because the truth was, she had never felt more alive than she had in his arms. But love, true love, was rebellion. And in the Vorl'Kai Empire, rebellion was treason. The breaking point. A sharp knock echoed through the chamber. Xyra stiffened. Daniel's expression didn't change, but she could see the shift in his stance. Ready, prepared. The door slid open, revealing Commander Varric, one of the Emperor's most trusted enforcers. His violet armor gleamed, his expression unreadable. Xyra stepped forward, mask in place. Cold. Calculated. "What is it?" The commander's sharp gaze flicked between her and Daniel before settling on her. "The Emperor requests your presence," he said, his tone laced with quiet suspicion. Xyra nodded. "I will come." Varric hesitated. Then, after a long glance at Daniel, he added, "He requests the human as well." Silence. Xyra's blood ran cold. Her father knew. A reckoning in the throne room. The imperial throne room was a vast, towering hall, carved from black obsidian and filled with 1,000 eyes. The Vorl'Kai High Council sat in their elevated seats, their expressions unreadable. At the center, the Emperor himself, a towering figure of pure authority, his golden cloak pooling around his massive throne. And before him, Daniel Carter and Princess Xyra. Daniel stood with the same unwavering confidence, his gaze locked on the Emperor, unbowed, unbroken. The Emperor's deep voice cut through the silence. "You have compromised the honor of the Empire, daughter." Xyra's fists clenched at her sides. "I have done no such thing." The Emperor's golden eyes narrowed. "You allowed yourself to be touched by a lesser species, to be claimed by one." The council murmured, whispers of outrage, disbelief, disgust. Daniel remained silent, watching, waiting. The Emperor turned his gaze on him. "And you, human, do you believe you are worthy of my daughter?" Daniel smiled. "I don't believe in worth, Your Majesty. I believe in choice." A ripple of tension passed through the council. Xyra stared at him, shocked. He was challenging her father. The Emperor's gaze darkened. "You are nothing but an insect beneath our rule. And yet, you resist. Why?" Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. "Because I love her." The words hit Xyra like a blast wave. He said it. Here, in front of her father, in front of the High Council, in front of the entire Vorl'Kai Empire. He said it. A hushed silence fell over the room. And then, laughter. The Emperor's deep, rumbling laughter echoed through the throne room, sharp and cruel. "Love," he spat, "a human's weakness." Xyra stepped forward. No, she said. A human strength. The entire room fell still. The Emperor's expression hardened. You would throw away your birthright for this thing. Xyra lifted her chin. I would throw away nothing, she said. But I will not live my life bound by your fears, father. The Emperor rose to his full height, his golden cloak sweeping behind him like a storm. You defy me. She exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time in her life, she spoke the truth. I love him. Daniel's breath hitched beside her. She had never said it aloud before. Her father's gaze burned with silent fury. And then he lifted a single hand. Guards stepped forward, weapons raised. Xyra's pulse pounded. She turned to Daniel. Run. He shook his head. I'm not leaving you. The Emperor's voice was cold, absolute. Kill the human. The guards moved. Daniel lunged. But before he could react, Xyra threw out her hand. And the guards froze. The entire room gasped. Xyra had never used her power against her own people before. But for him, she did. Slowly, she turned to her father. If you want him dead, she said, her voice a quiet storm, then you'll have to kill me too. The weight of her words slammed into the throne room like a meteor. Her father hesitated, and in that moment, Xyra knew. She had won. The aftermath. The rebellion began that night. It started as whispers, that the princess had chosen a human, that she had defied the Emperor, that perhaps love was not weakness, but power. Within days, planets allied with her. Within weeks, the Vorl'Kai Empire began to change. And at the center of it all, Daniel Carter and HFY Vorl'Kai standing side by side. Not as ruler and subject, not as conqueror and conquered, but as equals, as something greater, as the beginning of a new empire, built not on dominance, but on something far stronger. Love.